Welcome to this journey through one of the most deeply buried mysteries in Appalachian history, a tale so unsettling that entire communities conspired to erase it from memory. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about family bonds, isolation, and the darkness that can flourish when human beings exist beyond the reach of law and civilization. We're about to delve into a mystery that haunted the mountains of eastern Kentucky for nearly 4 decades, where a family patriarch ruled his hollow with such absolute authority that he became judge, jury, and executioner over dozens of lives. His legacy was so profoundly disturbing that when the truth finally emerged, officials deliberately burned court records, newspapers refused to print the details, and survivors scattered across the country, taking new names and swearing never to speak of their origins again. It was the year 1897. The United States was entering a new era of industrial prosperity. Electric lights illuminated the streets of major cities. The first subway system was under construction in Boston, and the country was just 2 years away from a new century that promised unprecedented progress and modernization. But in the remote valleys and hidden hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, particularly in the eastern reaches of Kentucky where the terrain grew increasingly hostile and the valleys increasingly isolated, the situation was entirely different. Time moved differently there. Authority was measured not by badges and courthouses, but by who controlled the mountain passes, who owned the largest tracts of timber, and who commanded the most fear. The region we must understand first, truly understand, is not just a location on a map, but a world unto itself. The Cumberland Plateau, where Kentucky bleeds into Virginia and Tennessee, is a landscape that seems designed to keep secrets. Imagine standing at the base of Pine Mountain, looking up at ridges that rise 3,000 feet into perpetual mist. The slopes are so steep that trees grow at impossible angles, their roots clawing into thin soil over limestone bedrock. Between these mountains lie the hollows, deep, narrow valleys where creeks run cold and fast over ancient stone, where the sun reaches the valley floor for only a few hours, even in summer, and where the walls seem to close in like the sides of a great stone throat, swallowing light and sound alike. In 1897, there were no roads through most of this country. What passed for trails were often nothing more than creek beds that became navigable only when the water ran low in late summer. Communities existed in profound isolation, separated from their nearest neighbors not by miles, but by the brutal vertical terrain that made those miles take days to traverse. A family living in one hollow might go an entire season without seeing another soul from outside their valley. Children grew to adulthood knowing only the dozen or so people who shared their isolated world. The outside, the world of railroads and telegraphs, of newspapers and law enforcement, might as well have existed on another planet. This isolation bred its own culture, its own rules. Extended family groups, clans really, controlled individual hollows with absolute authority. The eldest male typically held dominion over every aspect of life within his territory. Marriage arrangements, dispute resolution, punishment for transgressions, and even decisions about life and death. These patriarchs became, in effect, feudal lords over their domains. And because these hollows existed beyond the practical reach of county sheriffs or circuit judges, there was no authority to challenge them. No outside force to moderate their power or investigate their actions. The hollow that concerns us lay deep in Letcher County. Kentucky, accessible only by following Rockhouse Creek upstream for 7 miles from the nearest settlement, then turning into an unnamed tributary that locals called, with dark humor, Devil's Drain. The valley itself was perhaps half a mile long and narrow enough that a man with a strong arm could throw a stone from one ridge to the other. At its head, where the creek emerged from a spring beneath a limestone cliff, stood a rough-hewn log structure that served as the main house. Around it, scattered along the creek bank, were smaller cabins, some little more than lean-tos chinked with mud and moss. This was the domain of Ezekiel Thornwood. Ezekiel had arrived in the hollow in 1854, already a grown man with a wife and 3 children in tow. He claimed to be fleeing some unspecified trouble in Virginia, though no one pressed him for details. In that time and place, a man's past was his own business. What mattered was what he could make of himself in his new home. And Ezekiel, for all his dark qualities that would only emerge with time, was a formidable builder of his own empire. He was a large man, not merely tall but massively built, with shoulders that filled doorways and hands that could palm a man's skull like an apple. His face was all hard angles, a prominent ridge of brow, a nose that had been broken and healed crooked, a jaw like a plow blade. His eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of winter sky, and they held an expression that those who encountered him would later describe as simultaneously penetrating and empty, as though he could see through you while remaining utterly unmoved by what he found. Within 5 years, Ezekiel had claimed the entire hollow as his own through a combination of dubious legal maneuvering and simple intimidation. He acquired timber rights, mineral rights, and eventually outright ownership of every acre. He built the main house with his own hands, felling massive chestnuts and oaks and dragging them into place with a team of oxen. The structure was fortress-like, with walls a foot thick and windows positioned to provide clear sightlines down the valley. It was, unmistakably, the dwelling of a man who expected to defend his domain. His first wife, her name was Martha, though few records preserve even that small detail about her, bore him 7 more children in the hollow before she died in 1869, reportedly in childbirth, though no doctor ever examined her body and the child was never seen. Ezekiel remarried within 3 months, taking as his second wife a 17-year-old girl from a struggling family in the next valley over. Sarah Colton had little choice in the matter. Her father owed Ezekiel money for timber rights and saw the marriage as settlement of the debt. Sarah would bear Ezekiel 12 children over the next 20 years. But the household in the hollow grew even beyond this remarkable fecundity. Ezekiel's own children, as they reached maturity, did not leave. Instead, they married often each other, or if not, then carefully selected spouses from families so destitute or indebted that they had no power to refuse Ezekiel's arrangements, and established their own cabins within the hollow. These new households remained entirely under Ezekiel's authority. He dictated work schedules, approved or forbade travel, and controlled all commerce with the outside world. By 1880, more than 60 people lived in the hollow. All were related to Ezekiel by blood or marriage. All were subject to his absolute rule, and here is where the story becomes darker, where whispers began to circulate in the scattered communities downstream, where the first hints of something profoundly wrong started to seep out of that isolated valley like poison from a wound. Travelers who occasionally passed through the region, timber surveyors, the rare peddler brave enough to venture into the remote hollows, brought back disturbing reports. They spoke of children with haunted eyes who scattered like deer at the approach of strangers. They described women who would not speak in the presence of men, who bore scars and bruises they would not explain. They told of a community that seemed to exist in a state of perpetual quiet terror. One surveyor, a man named Thomas Ackerley, who was mapping timber resources for a Louisville-based lumber company in 1883, wrote in his private journal about an encounter that left him deeply unsettled. He had been following the creek upstream, making notations about the virgin timber stands, when he rounded a bend and came upon 2 young girls washing clothes on the rocks. They appeared to be perhaps 10 and 12 years old, both thin to the point of emaciation, wearing dresses so patched and ragged they barely qualified as clothing. I called out a greeting, Ackerley wrote, being careful to announce my presence from a distance so as not to startle them. But at the sound of my voice, both girls reacted with such violent alarm that the elder actually seized the younger and began dragging her toward the woods. I called out again, assuring them I meant no harm, that I was merely passing through. The elder girl stopped then, perhaps 50 feet away, and looked back at me. I will never forget her expression. It was not the natural wariness of a child encountering a stranger. It was the absolute, bone-deep terror of someone who has learned that other human beings are sources of pain. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Then they vanished into the laurel thickets, and I heard the elder girl hissing urgent warnings to the younger. He'll know, don't say nothing. He always knows. Ackerley had intended to continue upstream to survey the timber at the head of the valley, but something about the encounter unnerved him so profoundly that he instead retreated downstream and made a wide circuit through the forest to bypass that section entirely. I am not a superstitious man, he concluded in his journal, but there was a wrongness to that place that I could feel in my bones. Whatever was happening in that hollow, I wanted no part of discovering it. The whispers accumulated slowly. A midwife from the nearest settlement reported being summoned to the hollow in 1885 to attend a difficult birth. She arrived to find the young mother, she appeared to be barely 16, already in advanced labor in a cabin with no heat despite the frigid January weather. The girl was alone except for an older woman who sat in the corner, rocking and humming tunelessly. The midwife helped deliver the child, a boy who did not draw breath. As she cleaned the mother and prepared to wrap the tiny body, Ezekiel himself entered the cabin. He did not speak to me, the midwife later told her daughter, who recorded the account years after her mother's death. He simply took the dead infant from my hands, not roughly but with an authority that permitted no resistance, and walked out. I called after him, asking what he intended to do, whether he wanted me to help prepare the body for burial. He stopped in the doorway, his back to me, and said just 4 words, "We handle our own." Then he was gone. I finished attending to the mother, took my payment, which was left on a chair, not handed to me, and departed. As I was leaving, I saw Ezekiel near the creek. He was digging. When I returned home and my husband asked how it went, I told him I would never go back to that hollow again. Not for any amount of money. Other stories filtered out, each one individually explainable but collectively forming a disturbing pattern. A storekeeper in the settlement of Colton reported that every few months, one of Ezekiel's sons would arrive with a wagon to purchase supplies, flour, salt, cloth, and other essentials. The storekeeper noticed that the quantities seemed insufficient for a community he heard numbered in the dozens. More disturbing were the occasional special requests, lengths of chain, padlocks, and once, a large order of lime. When I asked what the lime was for, the storekeeper recounted to a newspaper reporter years later. The young man, I believe his name was Isaiah, one of Ezekiel's middle sons, just stared at me with those dead eyes they all had and said, "Pa needs it." I didn't ask anything further. There was something about those Thornwood men that made your skin crawl. They moved like they were only half alive, like puppets with their strings pulled by someone else. And they never ever smiled. The local circuit preacher, Reverend Josiah Whitcomb, attempted to hold a service in the hollow in 1887. He had heard rumors of the large community there and felt it his Christian duty to bring the word to those who had no regular access to organized worship. He made the arduous trek up the creek with his Bible and hymnal, arriving in mid-morning on a Sunday in June. What he found disturbed him so deeply that he wrote a letter to the Kentucky state government, though no action was ever taken in response. In his letter, preserved in state archives, Reverend Whitcomb described a community that seemed to exist in a state of spiritual darkness so profound it was almost palpable. The people gathered for his service. He estimated about 40 individuals, but they remained utterly silent throughout. When he tried to lead them in song, not a single voice joined his. When he asked if anyone had prayer requests, no one spoke. The children stared at him with expressions of what he described as ancient weariness, entirely inappropriate to their years. Most disturbing was his brief encounter with Ezekiel himself. The patriarch sat at the back of the gathering, not in reverence but in obvious surveillance of his people. After the service, as Reverend Whitcomb was preparing to depart, Ezekiel approached him. The Reverend described him as a man who seemed to occupy more space than his physical form should allow, whose very presence diminished the light around him. He thanked me for coming, Whitcomb wrote, but made it clear I would not be welcome to return. When I protested that these people needed regular spiritual guidance, he stepped close enough that I could smell the tobacco on his breath and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I am the only guidance they need. I am their judge, their jury, their shepherd, and when necessary, their executioner. This is my garden, Reverend, and I keep my own weeds." I confess that I fled. May God forgive me, but I did not argue. I did not insist. I simply left, and I have not returned. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Ezekiel Thornwood had established himself as an absolute dictator over his isolated domain. But it was not until 1896 that the full scope of his crimes began to emerge, and even then, only through accident. The discovery came in late October, when an early winter storm, one of those sudden Appalachian blizzards that can bury a mountain in 2 feet of snow overnight, struck the region. A young surveyor named Daniel Pritchard, caught in the storm while mapping timber resources for a railroad company considering a route through the area, sought shelter in the first structure he could find, a small cabin about 3 miles downstream from Ezekiel's main compound. The cabin appeared abandoned. Its door hung askew on leather hinges, and snow had already begun to accumulate inside. But it provided protection from the howling wind, and Pritchard gratefully ducked inside, intending to wait out the worst of the storm. He had matches and a small amount of food in his pack. He would be uncomfortable but safe. As he cleared a space on the dirt floor and began to look around for anything that might serve as fuel for a fire, he noticed something odd about the cabin's construction. The interior seemed smaller than the exterior dimensions suggested. He paced it off, 12 feet from front wall to back wall on the outside, but the interior was only 9 feet deep. 3 feet of space unaccounted for. He examined the rear wall more closely. It appeared to be double-boarded, with a gap between the inner and outer walls. And there, partially concealed by a wooden peg that served as a coat hook, was the edge of a crude door, merely a section of the wall that could swing open on concealed hinges. Pritchard later testified that his first thought was that he had discovered a simple storage space, perhaps where the cabin's former occupants had kept preserved foods or valuable tools. But when he pulled the hidden door open, the smell that emerged made him stagger backward, gagging. It was the unmistakable stench of decay, not fresh but old, the accumulated rot of organic matter decomposing over time in an enclosed space. He lit one of his precious matches, held it into the darkness, and looked into hell. The hidden room was perhaps 8 feet deep and extended the full 12-foot width of the cabin. The floor was packed earth, and protruding from that earth, arranged with disturbing precision, were bones. Human bones. Skulls primarily, though there were also long bones, femurs, humeri, standing upright like fence posts. Pritchard counted 12 skulls in the guttering light of his match before it burned his fingers and he dropped it, plunging the chamber back into darkness. He stood there in the storm-darkened cabin, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his mind refusing to process what he had seen. Then, driven by an impulse he would never be able to explain, perhaps simple horror, perhaps the trained observer's instinct to document what he had found, he lit another match and forced himself to look again. More carefully this time, the skulls varied in size. Some were clearly adults, but others were smaller. Much smaller. Children. Some appeared to have been there for years, the bone bleached and brittle. Others were newer, still showing traces of desiccated tissue. And as the match burned lower, its light illuminated something else. Scratches on the earthen walls. Not random marks, but deliberate carving, names, dates, and short phrases. God have mercy. He said we failed him. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. The match went out. In the sudden darkness, with the storm screaming outside and the presence of death surrounding him, Daniel Pritchard experienced what he would later describe as a moment of understanding so terrible that I wished I could unthink it. He suddenly knew, with absolute certainty, that this cabin was not an anomaly. It was not the work of a single madman acting alone. This was systematic, organized, and if there was one such chamber, there were likely others. He stumbled out of the cabin into the storm. The snow was falling so heavily now that he could barely see 20 feet ahead, but he no longer cared about finding shelter. He had to get away from that place, had to reach some form of authority, had to tell someone what he had found. He fought his way through thigh-deep drifts, following the creek downstream, falling repeatedly, soaking himself in the freezing water, but driven by an urgency that overrode his body's demands for rest and warmth. He reached the settlement of Colton after dark, nearly dead from hypothermia, and collapsed on the porch of the general store. The storekeeper, the same man who had sold supplies to Ezekiel's sons over the years, heard the commotion and dragged Pritchard inside. As they warmed him by the fire and forced hot coffee into him, Pritchard told his story in gasping, broken sentences. The storekeeper, his name was William McAllister, listened with an expression of growing horror. Not because he disbelieved Pritchard's account, but because, in a terrible way, it made sense of things he had noticed over the years. The insufficient quantities of supplies for a large community, the special orders for chains and lime, the dead-eyed men who came to do the purchasing, the rumors and whispers that everyone had heard, but no one had acted upon. I knew. McAllister would later testify in court, his voice breaking. God help me, on some level I knew. We all knew. But knowing and doing something about knowing are different things. That hollow was so remote, Ezekiel was so formidable, and we were cowards. We told ourselves it was none of our business. We told ourselves the rumors were exaggerated. We told ourselves 1,000 lies to avoid facing a truth that was too monstrous to confront. McAllister sent his son on horseback through the still-raging storm to the county seat in Whitesburg, 26 miles away. The young man arrived at dawn, half-frozen but alive, and delivered Pritchard's account to Sheriff Marcus Webb. Webb, a lean, weathered man in his 50s who had served as sheriff for nearly 2 decades, listened with increasing concern. He had heard the whispers about Ezekiel Thornwood over the years. Everyone in law enforcement in the region had. But the hollow's extreme remoteness and the lack of any specific, actionable complaints had always provided an excuse for inaction. Now he had no excuse. A credible witness had discovered physical evidence of multiple deaths. Whatever was happening in that hollow, it was now officially the law's business. But Webb faced a significant practical problem. He had a total of 3 deputies, and mounting an expedition into the hollow in the aftermath of a major snowstorm to potentially confront a man who commanded the loyalty of dozens of armed followers was essentially suicide. He needed manpower, and he needed men who knew the mountain country and could handle themselves in a fight. He sent riders to neighboring counties requesting assistance and dispatched messengers to the state capital in Frankfort, reporting the discovery and asking for state militia support if necessary. Then he did something that would later be criticized, but which, in the moment, seemed like the only practical option. He deputized a posse of local men, including several who had their own long-standing grievances with the Thornwood clan over disputed property lines and timber rights. It took 4 days to assemble a force of 23 men. They were not trained lawmen, but they were mountain men, familiar with the terrain and accustomed to hardship. Sheriff Webb divided them into 3 groups: a primary entry team that would approach the main compound directly, and 2 flanking teams that would position themselves on the ridges above the hollow to prevent escape and provide support if needed. On November 4th, 1896, the posse set out from Whitesburg at dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the mountains buried under snow that glittered in the cold sunlight like scattered diamonds. The temperature had plunged below freezing, and the creek was partly iced over, making the going treacherous. They moved slowly, quietly, knowing that if Ezekiel received warning of their approach, the situation could become deadly very quickly. They reached the hidden cabin where Pritchard had made his discovery around midday. Sheriff Webb insisted on examining the scene himself, taking 2 deputies with him while the rest of the posse remained outside. He lit a lantern and entered the concealed chamber. What he saw there, he was a hardened lawman who had seen his share of violence, but this was different. This was methodical, ritualistic. The bones were not simply hidden. They were displayed, arranged. There was a pride in this horror, a sick satisfaction in the careful positioning of the remains. Webb examined the carved messages on the walls with a growing sense of dread. The dates ranged from 1861 to 1895, 34 years, and based on the number of skulls visible, he counted 16 in this chamber alone, the death toll was already staggering. If there were other such chambers, he emerged from the cabin to find his deputies waiting with expressions of grim determination. "There's more," one of them said, pointing upstream. "Jackson found another cabin about a quarter-mile up. Same type of construction with a hidden rear section. He didn't go inside, but he could smell it." Webb made a decision that would later be questioned by legal scholars and historians. He decided to secure the main compound first, arrest Ezekiel and anyone else who resisted, and then conduct a systematic search of the entire hollow to document the full extent of the crimes. The alternative, spending time investigating each cabin while Ezekiel remained at large, potentially destroying evidence or harming witnesses, seemed even more dangerous. The posse moved upstream in formation, the main group following the creek while the 2 flanking teams climbed the ridges. It was silent work, their breath steaming in the frigid air, their weapons ready. As they approached the head of the valley, the main compound came into view through the bare trees. The large central house with smoke rising from its stone chimney, surrounded by perhaps a dozen smaller cabins scattered along the creek. And there, standing in front of the main house with his arms crossed, as though he had been expecting them, was Ezekiel Thornwood. At 67 years old, he remained an imposing figure. The years had stooped his shoulders somewhat and silvered his hair, but he still stood well over 6 feet tall. and his presence seemed to dominate the entire hollow. He wore a long coat of brown wool and held a rifle in the crook of his arm, not aimed at the approaching lawman, but clearly ready. Behind him, the door of the house stood open and shapes moved in the darkness within. Sheriff Webb raised his hand, signaling his men to stop about 50 yards from the house. He took several steps forward, alone, his own rifle held in a non-threatening position. "Ezekiel Thornwood," he called out, his voice echoing off the hollow's walls. "I'm Sheriff Marcus Webb of Letcher County. I need to speak with you." Ezekiel's response was immediate and cold. "You're on my land without invitation. Turn around and leave while I'm still allowing it." Webb stood his ground. "I have credible reports of serious crimes committed in this hollow. I'm here in my capacity as a law enforcement officer to investigate those reports. I'm asking you to cooperate peacefully." "The only law in this hollow is mine," Ezekiel replied, and there was no anger in his voice, only a flat, absolute certainty. "What happens here is my business and my business alone. You have no authority here, Sheriff, none whatsoever." "That's where you're wrong," Webb said, and now he allowed some steel to enter his tone. "The law of Kentucky reaches every corner of this state, including this hollow. Now, you can cooperate, or we can do this the hard way. But one way or another, I'm going to conduct my investigation." For a long moment, Ezekiel simply stared at the sheriff. Then, without warning, he raised his rifle and fired. The shot went high, whistling over Webb's head, a warning shot. Not an attempt to kill, but a clear statement of intent. The hollow erupted into chaos. Webb dove behind a large boulder as the rest of the posse opened fire at the main house. Windows shattered and wood splintered as bullets tore into the logs. From inside the house and from several of the surrounding cabins, return fire erupted. The flanking teams on the ridges began firing down into the compound, trying to suppress the resistance without hitting the posse members below. The gunfight lasted perhaps 3 minutes, though to those involved, it seemed like hours. The sound was deafening, amplified by the hollow's walls until it seemed like the mountain itself was screaming. Gunsmoke hung in the cold air like fog, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. Sheriff Webb, his ears ringing, cautiously raised his head. The main house's door stood open, and a white cloth, it looked like a torn bedsheet, hung from a broken window. "A surrender flag! Hold your fire!" Webb shouted to his men. Then more loudly toward the house, "Come out! Hands where we can see them! All of you!" The response was immediate. People began emerging from the house and the surrounding cabins. Men, women, children. They came out slowly, hands raised or held to their sides, their expressions not of defiance, but of something far more disturbing, relief. It was as though they had been waiting for this moment, hoping for it, and now that it had arrived, some long-held tension was finally releasing. Webb counted 47 people in total. Many of the women were crying, but they were not tears of fear or anger. They were tears of release, of deliverance. Several children clung to their mothers, while others simply stood and stared with those same dead eyes that so many observers had noted over the years. And Ezekiel? He emerged last from the main house, his rifle left behind. He walked with his head high, his expression one of contempt rather than defeat. As deputies moved forward to place him in chains, he spoke just once, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You'll find out. You'll search this hollow, and you'll find what I've built here. And then you'll understand that I did what was necessary. Every single one of them failed me. Every single one of them deserved what they got." The temperature seemed to drop at his words. Even the hardened men of the posse felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. Because implicit in that statement was confirmation of what they had all begun to suspect. The hidden chambers were not the work of some unknown killer. They were Ezekiel's work. This was his kingdom, and these were his crimes. "He told us that the outside world had fallen into sin and degradation," Sarah said. "That cities were Sodom and Gomorrah, that the government was evil, that anyone who left would be destroyed by the wickedness out there. He said he was protecting us by keeping us separate, pure, and for a long time, especially the children who were born here and never knew anything else." They believed him. We believed him. Because what was the alternative? To acknowledge that we were prisoners? That the monster wasn't out in the world, but right here, sleeping in the main house? Other survivors corroborated and expanded on Sarah's testimony. Isaiah Thornwood, one of Ezekiel's middle sons, now 43 years old, provided details about the hidden chambers. He admitted, with visible shame, that he had helped construct several of them under his father's direction, though he claimed, and investigators later believed him, that he had not initially understood their purpose. He said they were for storage. Isaiah testified, his voice hollow. Said we needed places to keep things dry and safe from animals. It wasn't until I saw him carry the first body into one that I understood. I was maybe 20 years old. The victim was a cousin of mine, a young man named Jacob who had tried to run away. Father caught him about 3 miles down the creek, dragged him back, and beat him to death in front of all of us. Then he made me help carry the body to one of the cabins and place it in the chamber. That's when I saw that there were already bones there, several sets of bones, and I realized that this had been going on for years, long before I was old enough to notice or understand. Why hadn't he gone to authorities? Why hadn't he run away himself? Isaiah's answer was simple and devastating. Because I had a wife and 3 children, and he made it clear that if I ever betrayed him, they would pay the price. So I did what he said. I helped him. I became his tool, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. The investigation also revealed that Ezekiel's victims were not random. They followed a pattern that spoke to his twisted psychology. He killed those who questioned his authority, yes, but he also killed those who he deemed had failed him in various ways. A son-in-law who could not clear enough timber in a day, a daughter who bore stillborn children, a grandson who showed signs of physical weakness or intellectual limitation. Anyone who did not fit his vision of what his community should be became expendable. And the children, the investigation revealed at least 19 children, among the dead, were often victims of what Ezekiel apparently considered mercy. If a child was born with physical deformities or showed signs of illness that Ezekiel believed would make them a burden, he would take them from their mothers within hours of birth. The mothers often never saw their children again. Some were told the infants had died naturally. Others were told nothing at all, left to wonder and grieve in silence. Rebecca Thornwood, Isaiah's wife, testified about losing 2 children this way. Her voice was flat, emotionless, as though the trauma had burned out her capacity for feeling. The first was born with a twisted foot. Ezekiel came into the cabin where I was recovering, looked at the baby for maybe 10 seconds and said, "This one won't do." He picked her up, she was only 3 hours old, and walked out. I tried to follow him, but his daughter Martha held me down. She was crying, saying I had to let it go, that fighting would only make things worse. I heard my baby crying for maybe 5 minutes. Then silence. Then I heard digging sounds from behind the cabin. The next morning there was fresh turned earth near the tree line, and no one would look at me. Her second child, a boy, was born premature but seemed healthy despite his small size. But Ezekiel said he was too weak, that he wouldn't survive the winter, so there was no point wasting food and care on him. He took that baby too. That one I fought for. I screamed. I clawed at him. I begged. He hit me hard enough to crack 2 ribs, took my son, and I never saw him again. That was 8 years ago. I stopped speaking after that. What was the point of words when they changed nothing? The testimonies continued, each one adding another layer to the portrait of systematic cruelty. But it was the testimony of a 19-year-old woman named Emily Thornwood, Ezekiel's granddaughter through his eldest son, that finally revealed the full scope of the horror and explained why the community had never, despite their numbers, risen up against their oppressor. Emily was slight, barely 100 pounds, with dark hair that hung lank around a face that seemed to have aged far beyond her years. She sat before the investigators with her hands folded in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and precise, as though she had rehearsed this testimony in her mind 1,000 times. He controlled us through isolation, through violence and through something else, she said. He made us complicit. He didn't just kill people himself. He forced us to participate, to watch, to help, to become guilty alongside him. That way, we couldn't tell anyone, because we weren't just victims anymore. We were accomplices. She described an incident from 2 years earlier, when a young man named Thomas, one of Ezekiel's grandsons, had managed to sneak away from the hollow and reach the settlement of Colton. He had apparently intended to contact authorities, but he had been raised in such complete isolation that he barely knew how to interact with outsiders. He had created a disturbance in the general store, speaking wildly about murder and mass graves, and the storekeeper, McAllister, instead of taking him seriously, had assumed he was drunk or mentally disturbed and sent word to Ezekiel that one of his people needed collecting. Ezekiel retrieved Thomas personally, bringing him back to the hollow without incident. That night, he convened the entire community in the clearing. Thomas was bound to a wooden post that Ezekiel had erected for exactly such occasions. And then Ezekiel announced that Thomas's betrayal had endangered all of them, that his loose tongue could bring destruction down on their entire community, and that justice must be served. But he didn't execute Thomas immediately, Emily said, her voice beginning to shake now. He made it a lesson. He said that since Thomas's crime affected all of us, we all had to participate in the punishment. He handed out stones, not large rocks, but stones about the size of a hen's egg, and he told us that we each had to throw one stone at Thomas. Anyone who refused would take Thomas's place on the post. The clearing had stood in horrified silence. Then Ezekiel's oldest son, following his father's unspoken command, threw the first stone. It struck Thomas in the chest. Then another family member threw. Then another. It took a long time, Emily whispered, because we were aiming to miss or hitting him in places that wouldn't cause serious injury. We were trying to drag it out, hoping someone would intervene, hoping Ezekiel would call it off. But he just stood there watching, and eventually he got impatient. He took a stone himself, threw it hard enough that I heard Thomas's skull crack from 20 feet away. After that, Thomas stopped moving, but Ezekiel made us continue until every single person had thrown their stone at the body, even the children, especially the children. Emily looked up at the investigators, tears streaming down her face now. Don't you understand? After that, how could any of us go to authorities? We had killed someone. We were murderers too. That's how he kept us. Not just through fear of what he'd do to us, but through the knowledge of what he'd made us do. The legal proceedings that followed were unlike anything Kentucky had seen before or would see again. The scale of the crimes, the number of victims, and the complexity of determining culpability among the survivors created challenges that the legal system was ill-equipped to handle. Ezekiel Thornwood was formally charged with 63 counts of murder. The prosecution, led by Commonwealth Attorney James Blackburn, faced an unusual problem. They had overwhelming physical evidence, the bodies themselves, the hidden chambers, the testimony of dozens of witnesses, but much of the evidence raised deeply disturbing questions about the nature of guilt and complicity that the law struggled to address. Were the family members who had helped construct the hidden chambers guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, even if they claimed not to have known their purpose? Were those who had been forced to participate in executions guilty of murder themselves, or were they victims acting under duress? What about those who had simply witnessed crimes and remained silent? Were they accessories after the fact? Or were they prisoners who had no means of reporting the crimes they had witnessed? Attorney Blackburn made a difficult decision. He would prosecute only Ezekiel himself for murder. Other family members who had directly participated in killings might face lesser charges of complicity or obstruction of justice, but the full weight of the law would fall on the man who had orchestrated it all. This decision was both pragmatic. Securing convictions against dozens of traumatized witnesses who had acted under extreme duress would have been nearly impossible, and moral, recognizing that Ezekiel's absolute control over the Hollow had effectively stripped his family members of free will. Ezekiel's face darkened, and he took a step toward her, but his chains brought him up short. Sarah didn't flinch. You didn't kill for purity. You killed for pleasure, for power, because it made you feel like the god you wanted to be. You killed a 3-day-old infant because she had a twisted foot, not to spare her suffering, but because perfection was required in your kingdom, and imperfection insulted you. You killed Jacob because he questioned whether we really needed to work 18-hour days in the timber, and that question challenged your authority. You killed Martha Colton, my predecessor, your first wife in that hollow, because she was getting old and you wanted a younger woman in your bed. Don't you dare dress up your evil as philosophy. It was evil, pure, simple, monstrous evil. For the first time in the entire trial, Ezekiel's composure cracked. You ungrateful, I gave you everything. I protected you. I made you safe. You made us prisoners, Sarah shouted, and now tears were streaming down her face, but her voice never wavered. You made us slaves. You made us watch our children die and smile and say, yes, Father, and pretend it was justice. You made us accomplices to horror. And you call that protection? You call that safety? She turned to the jury, her arms spread wide. He stands here talking about natural law and survival of the fittest, but let me tell you what the truth was. He was a tyrant who found a place remote enough that no one could stop him. That's all. not a philosopher, not a prophet, just a murderer who got away with it for 40 years because he chose his victims carefully, people who had no voice, no power, no way to call for help. And the greatest tragedy is that we let him. We were so broken, so controlled, so afraid, that we let him. The courtroom erupted in noise, gasps, shouts, the scratch of pencils as reporters frantically captured every word. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When silence finally returned, Sarah had returned to her seat, her body shaking with emotion but her face set with grim satisfaction. She had spoken. Finally, after 3 decades of enforced silence, she had spoken truth to power. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned verdicts of guilty on all 63 counts of murder. The judge, a distinguished gentleman named Charles Harmon, who had presided over criminal cases for 26 years, took his time with the sentencing. He first addressed the courtroom, acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the case and the profound moral questions it raised. Then he turned to Ezekiel. "Ezekiel Thornwood," he said, "in my years on the bench, I have sentenced men to death for killing one person. I have never imagined I would face a case where the death toll reached the dozens. The law provides only one punishment for first-degree murder in this Commonwealth: death by hanging. I hereby sentence you to be hanged by the neck until dead, sentenced to be carried out on the 15th day of July, 1897, at the State Penitentiary in Frankfurt." He paused, then added something that was not strictly necessary, but which seemed to demand saying. "You spoke of natural law, of survival of the fittest, of the necessity of culling the weak. Very well, let natural law have its say. You are now at the mercy of the very legal system you rejected. The strong have judged you, not through personal tyranny, but through the collective will of society expressed through law. And that judgment is that you have no place in civilization. May God have mercy on your soul, sir, for this court has none to offer." Ezekiel was escorted from the courtroom, and for the first time since his capture, the observers saw something like fear flicker across his face. The reality of his situation had finally penetrated. He was no longer the king of his hollow. He was a condemned man, and the date of his death had been written on a court document in official ink. The weeks following the trial saw a flurry of legal and administrative activity. The question of what to do with the surviving Thornwood family members created complex challenges. Most had been so psychologically damaged by their experiences that immediate reintegration into normal society seemed impossible. Many had never learned to read or write. Some had never ventured more than a few miles from the hollow. They knew nothing of currency, employment, or independent living. The Commonwealth of Kentucky, with the support of several charitable organizations, established a rehabilitation facility in the town of Hazard, about 40 miles from the hollow. Here, survivors could receive medical treatment, psychological counseling, rudimentary by modern standards, but well-intentioned, education in basic literacy and numeracy, and training in practical skills that would allow them to support themselves. The response was mixed. Some survivors, particularly the younger ones, embraced the opportunity to build new lives. Emily Thornwood, whose testimony had been so crucial to the trial, learned to read within 6 months and eventually trained as a teacher, dedicating her life to educating mountain children. Isaiah Thornwood struggled with guilt and depression, but eventually found work as a carpenter, remarrying late in life to a widow who knew his history and accepted it. Others never recovered. Several survivors, unable to adapt to freedom and haunted by their experiences, took their own lives within the first year. Still others simply disappeared into the mountains, seeking isolation similar to what they had known in the hollow, unable to tolerate the complexity and stimulus of normal society. Sarah Thornwood fell into this latter category. After the trial, she accepted placement in the rehabilitation facility, but she rarely spoke and showed little interest in the educational or vocational programs offered. After 3 months, she quietly walked out one morning and was never seen again. Some believed she returned to the hollow, unable to leave the only home she had known. Others theorized she disappeared into one of the countless remote valleys, seeking peace and solitude. Her fate remains unknown. The hollow itself became the subject of intense debate. Some argued it should be burned to the ground, every structure destroyed, every trace of Ezekiel's kingdom erased from the earth. Others believed it should be preserved as a testament to the crimes committed there, a warning to future generations about what humans are capable of when isolation and unchecked power combine. In the end, a compromise of sorts emerged. The hidden chambers were filled in, and the cabins where they had been located were burned. The main house and several other structures were left standing but abandoned. The Commonwealth claimed the property through a legal process that compensated the surviving family members, then effectively left it vacant. Over time, the forest reclaimed the hollow. Trees grew up through floors. Walls collapsed under the weight of snow. Within 20 years, only those who knew exactly where to look could find any trace of the buildings. But before the hollow was abandoned, before nature was allowed to erase the physical evidence, authorities undertook one final, gruesome task: proper burial of the victims. The process took weeks. Each set of remains was carefully exhumed from the hidden chambers, examined as thoroughly as possible to determine identity, and then prepared for burial. In some cases, identification was possible through clothing remnants, personal effects, or distinctive skeletal features that family members could recognize. In many cases, it was not. These unknown victims were given numbered markers: Victim 1, Victim 2, and so on. A plot was established in the Whitesburg Town Cemetery, on a hillside overlooking the mountains where these people had lived and died. A single large monument was erected, listing the names of all identified victims and acknowledging the unknown ones. The inscription, composed by Reverend Whitcomb, who had visited the hollow years before, read simply, "Here lie the victims of tyranny. May they find in death the peace that was denied them in life. May their suffering serve as warning and their memory demand justice." 1896. The burial service, held on a gray day in late May, drew hundreds of observers. All of the surviving family members attended, standing together in a tight group as though they still drew comfort from proximity to one another. As the caskets were lowered into the ground, 63 of them, ranging from full-sized to heartbreakingly small, many wept openly. For the first time, they could grieve publicly. For the first time, their loved ones were acknowledged, honored, remembered. Emily Thornwood, who had emerged as something of a spokesperson for the survivors, read a brief statement she had written. "We do not ask you to forgive us for our silence, our complicity, our failure to stop what was happening. We cannot forgive ourselves. But we ask you to remember that we were victims too, trapped in a nightmare we could not escape. And we ask you to remember them, all of them, not as a collection of bones in hidden chambers, but as people. They had names. They had dreams. They deserved better. We all deserve better." July 15, 1897 dawned clear and hot in Frankfort. A crowd of several thousand had gathered outside the state penitentiary, many having traveled from across Kentucky and neighboring states to witness the execution. The newspapers had turned Ezekiel Thornwood into a national figure. The Hollow King, they called him, or the Mountain Monster. His crimes had been detailed in lurid prose in papers from New York to San Francisco. His pseudo-philosophical justifications had been analyzed, condemned, and cited as evidence of the moral decay that could occur in isolated, lawless places. Inside the prison, Ezekiel had spent his final weeks refusing visitors, refusing the chaplain's spiritual counsel, and maintaining his defiant stance that he had done nothing wrong. He did accept one visitor, a writer from a Philadelphia newspaper who was compiling a book about the case. Their conversation, which the writer later published, revealed a man whose grip on reality had perhaps never been firm and had now loosened entirely. "They'll make me a villain," Ezekiel told the writer. "But in time, people will understand. Society is weak because it protects the weak. Natural selection has been suspended by law and medicine and charity. I simply implemented natural selection within my domain. I was ahead of my time. Future generations will see the wisdom in it." When the writer asked if he felt any remorse for the children he had killed, Ezekiel's response was chilling. "Remorse implies wrongdoing. I did what had to be done. Those children were flawed. I spared them lives of suffering. That was kindness, not cruelty." The writer, disturbed by the interview, ended the piece with a note. "Mr. Thornwood is either a man of such profound evil that he has transcended any possibility of redemption, or he is utterly insane and always has been. Which possibility is more disturbing, I cannot say." At precisely 10 a.m., Ezekiel Thornwood was led from his cell to the gallows that had been erected in the prison yard. He walked without assistance, his bearing still erect despite his chains. The execution was witnessed by state officials, representatives of the families of the victims, and selected members of the press. The warden read the sentence and asked if Ezekiel had any final words. For a long moment it seemed he would remain silent. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the silent yard. "I am the mountain, and the mountain keeps its secrets. You can kill me, but you can't kill what I built. It will endure." "It will—" The warden signaled the executioner, and the trap dropped before Ezekiel could finish his sentence. His death was reportedly quick, his neck breaking instantly. His body was left hanging for the required 15 minutes, then cut down and prepared for burial. But here the story takes another dark turn. Ezekiel had made arrangements, through a lawyer, for his body to be transported back to eastern Kentucky and buried in the hollow he had ruled for so long. The Commonwealth initially refused, but legal precedent suggested that a prisoner had the right to determine the disposition of his remains, and after some debate, the request was granted. A small party, the lawyer, 2 guards, and a driver, transported the coffin by train to the nearest railroad station, then by wagon along increasingly rough roads toward the hollow. They planned to bury him in an unmarked grave near the ruins of his main house, complete the paperwork, and depart. They arrived in late afternoon, as shadows were lengthening across the valley. As they unloaded the coffin and prepared to dig the grave, they became aware that they were not alone. Figures emerged from the forest, survivors of the Thornwood family, perhaps a dozen of them, who had somehow learned of the burial plans and had come to witness it. The lawyer, a young man named Patrick Sullivan who had never set foot in the hollow before, later wrote an account of what happened next. As the guards began to dig, one of the survivors, Sullivan didn't get his name, stepped forward. "Not there," the man said. "He doesn't get to rest in the place he corrupted. He doesn't get to stay in the hollow." Sullivan explained that the legal documents specified burial in the hollow, and he was bound to fulfill those terms. The survivor shook his head. "The papers say in the hollow. They don't specify where. Dig there." He pointed to a spot near the creek, in deep shadow under the cliff. The guards, clearly uncomfortable with the situation and surrounded by people who had every reason to hate the man they were burying, complied. They dug in the indicated spot. As they worked, more survivors arrived, until perhaps 20 people stood in a silent circle around the gravesite. When the grave was deep enough, they lowered the coffin. Before they could begin filling it, another survivor, a woman Sullivan did not identify, stepped forward with a bucket. She poured its contents into the grave onto the coffin. The stench made Sullivan stagger back. It was a mixture of animal waste, rotted food, and other decomposing organic matter. "That's what we think of his philosophy," the woman said. "That's what we think of his natural law. Let him rot in it." Others came forward, each adding their own offerings to the grave. Rocks, which they dropped onto the coffin with loud thuds. Salt, which they scattered with ritual precision. Iron nails, which they drove into the ground around the grave. One older man produced a small Bible, read a passage. Sullivan couldn't hear the words, and then spat on the book before throwing it into the grave. Sullivan, horrified and deeply moved, made no attempt to stop them. The guards stood back, their hands on their weapons, but making no move to intervene. This was something beyond law, beyond their authority to control. This was collective exorcism, a community attempting to banish the demon that had haunted them. When they had finished, the survivors simply walked away, disappearing back into the forest as silently as they had arrived. Sullivan and the guards filled the grave, tamped down the earth, and placed no marker. As they left the hollow for the last time, Sullivan looked back and saw that someone, he never learned who, had placed a single item on the fresh grave, a small white cross made of wood, but positioned upside down. "I do not know if I believe in God," Sullivan wrote in his account. "But if I do, I hope he was present in that hollow on that day. I hope he saw what those people did, understood their need to reclaim even this small piece of power over their tormentor. And I hope, though I am not sure I truly believe it, that Ezekiel Thornwood's soul faces judgment for his crimes, before a tribunal far more just than any earthly court could be. The story of Ezekiel Thornwood and the hollow does not end with his execution and burial. The ripples of his crime spread outward through time, affecting generations and raising questions that remain relevant more than a century later. In the immediate aftermath, a debate erupted in newspapers and academic journals about the nature of isolated communities and the dangers they posed. Some argued for increased government oversight of remote regions, for mandatory education laws that would force children from isolated areas into contact with broader society, for greater law enforcement presence in rural America. Others saw such proposals as government overreach, arguing that the Thornwood case was an aberration and that most isolated communities were peaceful and law-abiding. The debate was never truly resolved. Remote communities continued to exist, some maintaining practices and beliefs quite different from mainstream society. But the Thornwood case became a cautionary tale, cited whenever discussions arose about the limits of parental authority, community autonomy, or religious freedom. From a psychological perspective, the case attracted attention from early psychologists and sociologists attempting to understand tyranny and totalitarian control. How had one man maintained absolute authority over dozens of people for decades? Why had no one successfully escaped and sought help? What combination of isolation, violence, psychological manipulation, and social control had created such an effective prison without walls? These questions became more urgent as the 20th century unfolded and the world witnessed totalitarian regimes on a grand scale. Stalin's Soviet Union, Hitler's Germany, Mao's China, where the dynamics of the Thornwood Hollow were replicated across entire nations. Scholars studying these regimes often return to the Thornwood case as a small-scale model of how such systems operated. The creation of isolated populations, the establishment of absolute authority, the use of public execution to terrify the population, the forcing of populations to participate in atrocities to make them complicit. Dr. Margaret Hastings, a psychologist who studied the Thornwood survivors in the 1920s, wrote that what Ezekiel Thornwood created in his hollow was not merely a criminal enterprise but a totalitarian microstate. He understood, whether through instinct or calculation, the mechanisms of control that would later be formalized by 20th century dictators. Isolation from competing information sources, cultivation of dependence, strategic use of violence, and the creation of a mythology that positioned him as the sole source of wisdom and protection. The survivors themselves had varied fates, as mentioned earlier. But their descendants, those who went on to have families and share their histories, carried the weight of the hollow with them. Genealogists and oral historians who have studied the Thornwood families report that shame and silence characterized most families' approach to their heritage. Many descendants learned only in adulthood that they had connection to the infamous case. Some changed their surnames to escape the association. Others moved far from Kentucky, seeking places where no one would recognize their family name. But some descendants have, in recent decades, begun to reclaim their history. They argue that their ancestors were victims, not villains, and that the shame should rest solely on Ezekiel himself. They have established a small museum in Hazard, Kentucky, containing documents, photographs, and artifacts related to the case. They have worked to identify the unmarked graves and provide names to victims who had been listed only as numbers. They have created a website where descendants can share family stories and memories. One such descendant, a woman named Jennifer Thornwood Martinez who lives in California, wrote in 2018, "For years I denied my heritage. When people asked about my unusual middle name, I claimed it was my mother's maiden name and changed the subject. But I've come to realize that denying who I am, where I come from, means letting Ezekiel win. He tried to bury his victims. He tried to make their suffering invisible. By hiding my connection to them, I was continuing his work. So now I say it openly. I am descended from survivors of the Thornwood Hollow horror. My great-great-grandmother was Sarah Thornwood, Ezekiel's second wife. She survived. She escaped. And I am living proof that his victims were stronger than he ever understood. They endured. They survived. They created futures he never imagined. That is my heritage, and I am proud of it. The hollow itself, as mentioned, has returned to wilderness. The structures have collapsed and rotted. Trees grow where buildings once stood. The creek still flows cold and clear, oblivious to the horrors that once occurred along its banks. The filled-in burial chambers are invisible beneath layers of leaves and forest debris. But people still visit. Hikers who know the history sometimes make the difficult trek up Rockhouse Creek and into the tributary valley, seeking the hollow out of historical interest or dark curiosity. Some report feeling a profound unease in the valley, a sense of wrongness that has nothing to do with the physical environment and everything to do with knowing what happened there. Others feel nothing unusual, seeing only a peaceful mountain valley where nature has reclaimed land that was briefly, terribly, shaped by human cruelty. Local residents have mixed feelings about the occasional visitors. Some resent the intrusion, feeling that the hollow should be left alone, that the dead deserve peace, and the survivors deserve to have their trauma forgotten rather than constantly revisited. Others believe the story must be remembered, that forgetting would dishonor the victims and risk repeating the mistakes that allowed such horrors to occur. There are persistent rumors, though no confirmed reports, that the hollow is haunted. Some hikers claim to hear sounds, children crying in the distance, a man's voice raised in anger, the clank of chains. Others report seeing figures moving through the trees, always at the edge of vision, vanishing when looked at directly. Local paranormal investigators have conducted several investigations in the hollow, though their findings are inconclusive and largely dismissed by serious historians. Whether or not literal ghosts haunt the hollow, metaphorical ghosts certainly do. The memory of what happened there lingers in the region's collective consciousness. It serves as a dark counterpoint to romantic notions of mountain life and pioneer self-sufficiency. It reminds us that isolation can corrupt, that power without accountability can become monstrous, that ordinary human beings can commit extraordinary evils when circumstances permit and conscience is sufficiently suppressed. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization of how close Ezekiel came to complete success. If that surveyor, Thomas Ackerley, had not encountered those frightened girls washing clothes in the creek in 1883, would anyone ever have questioned what was happening in the hollow? If Daniel Pritchard had not sought shelter in that specific cabin during the 1896 storm, would the hidden chambers ever have been discovered? How many more years could Ezekiel's reign have continued? How many more victims would there have been? And the darker question, how many other isolated places harbored or still harbor similar horrors? How many other petty tyrants rule over small kingdoms beyond the effective reach of law and civilization? The Thornwood case was discovered largely by accident. How many have never been discovered at all? These questions have no comfortable answers. The story of Ezekiel Thornwood and the hollow he ruled remains a disturbing reminder that evil does not always announce itself with obvious villainy. It often wraps itself in the language of protection, purity, and natural order. It positions itself as necessary, as harsh, but ultimately beneficial. And it thrives in darkness, in isolation, in places where questions are not asked and witnesses are silenced. But questions remain even now, more than a century after Ezekiel's execution. Some are historical. How many victims were there really? The official count was 63, but that number was based only on remains that were discovered. Were there more burial sites now lost to time and nature? How did Ezekiel first develop his philosophy of absolute control? Was it present from the beginning, or did it evolve gradually as his isolation and power increased? Other questions are more personal, more immediate. What became of Sarah Thornwood after she disappeared? Did she find peace, or did she carry her trauma until her death? What happened to the children born in the hollow after the rescue? Did they fully integrate into society, or were they forever marked by their early experiences? And what of Ezekiel's grave? Is it still there, unmarked and forgotten, slowly eroding back into the mountain earth? To this day, when autumn storms sweep through the Cumberland Plateau, when fog fills the valleys and the mountains disappear into gray oblivion, old-timers in Letcher County will tell you to stay out of certain hollows. They won't always explain why. They'll just say that some places hold memories in their soil, that some valleys remember the blood that was spilled there, that some creeks still carry the echoes of voices that were silenced too soon. And on the quietest nights, when the wind drops to nothing and the forest holds its breath, people living in the scattered communities downstream from Devil's Drain, which is what the locals still call that tributary, despite efforts to give it a more respectable name, report hearing something. Not clearly enough to identify, not loudly enough to be certain. Just a sound that might be wind through bare branches, or might be water over stones, or might be something else entirely. Something that sounds almost like whispers, almost like warnings, almost like the mountain itself trying to tell its secrets to anyone willing to listen. The stone monument in Whitesburg Cemetery has weathered more than a century of mountain seasons. The names carved into it have faded somewhat, requiring careful examination to read. Every few years, someone, Descendants, historians, or simply people moved by the story leave flowers at its base. On the anniversary of the discovery, November 4th, there are often dozens of bouquets, a splash of color against the gray stone, a reminder that these victims are not forgotten. The rehabilitation facility in Hazard where survivors received treatment closed in 1923, its mission complete. The building served various purposes over the decades: a school, a community center, a nursing home, before finally being demolished in 1987. A small plaque marks where it stood. Here, survivors of darkness learn to walk in light. The courthouse in Whitesburg where Ezekiel was tried still stands, though it has been expanded and modernized. The courtroom where the trial took place is now used for storage, but occasionally, during historical society events, it's opened for tours. Guides point out where Ezekiel sat, where Sarah made her powerful statement, where the jury deliberated on one of the most significant criminal cases in Kentucky history. And the hollow? It waits, silent, empty, slowly being erased by time and nature, its secrets buried beneath leaf litter and new growth. The creek still flows, the cliffs still rise, the mountains still stand as they have for millennia, patient and indifferent to the brief, violent intrusion of human evil into their ancient landscape. But the story endures. It is passed down through generations, told in different forms, as history, as legend, as cautionary tale. It appears in academic papers and true crime books. It is discussed in college classrooms studying abnormal psychology, criminal justice, and American social history. It is whispered around campfires by people who enjoy dark tales of Appalachian horror, and perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the best way to honor the victims, those 63 confirmed dead, and however many others were never found, is to remember, to tell their story, to ensure that what happened in that isolated hollow does not fade into comfortable obscurity, but remains visible, uncomfortable, challenging. Because the Thornwood case asks questions we would often prefer not to answer. What is our responsibility to intervene when we suspect something terrible is happening behind closed doors, in isolated communities, in places where we are not directly affected? How do we balance respect for privacy and autonomy with the duty to protect the vulnerable? When whispers and rumors reach our ears, do we investigate, or do we tell ourselves it's not our business? These questions echo through time. They were relevant in 1897, when neighbors heard rumors about the hollow and chose not to investigate. They were relevant in the 20th century as the world learned about atrocities committed in isolated communities and totalitarian states. And they remain relevant today, in an age where isolation can be psychological as well as geographical, where abuse can hide behind closed doors in suburban neighborhoods as easily as in mountain hollows, where the question of when to intervene and when to respect privacy remains uncomfortably complex. The victims of Ezekiel Thornwood deserve more than our momentary horror at their fate. They deserve our reflection on what allowed their suffering to continue for so long. They deserve our commitment to ensuring that isolation, whether physical or social, never again provides sufficient cover for such systematic cruelty. They deserve our acknowledgement that they were people with names and dreams and potential that was stolen from them. And Ezekiel himself. History has rendered its verdict, and it is harsh. He is remembered not as the philosopher king he imagined himself to be, but as a monster, a cautionary tale, a study in the pathology of unchecked power. His name is synonymous with cruelty and tyranny. His legacy is measured not in the kingdom he built, but in the lives he destroyed. Time has not vindicated him. Future generations have not seen wisdom in his actions. His prediction that history would understand him was as deluded as every other aspect of his twisted worldview. The mountain keeps many secrets, as Ezekiel said in his final words. But this particular secret has been dragged into the light, examined, and judged. And the mountain, indifferent as always, continues to stand, witness to human evil, yes, but also witness to human resilience. To the survivors who escaped, rebuilt their lives, and created futures that their oppressor never imagined possible. If this journey through one of Appalachia's darkest chapters has moved you, if you find yourself contemplating the nature of power, isolation, and human cruelty in ways that extend beyond this specific case, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, stories buried in courthouse archives and fading memories, stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about our shared past, stories that deserve to be examined with the careful attention that honors those who lived them. Leave a like if this account has provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, if it has made you think about our responsibilities to each other, about the price of silence, about the importance of bearing witness to difficult histories. And in the comments, share your thoughts. What responsibility do we bear as a society to intervene when we suspect isolated communities may harbor abuse? How do we balance respect for privacy with protection of the vulnerable? Have you encountered stories from your own region's history that echo the themes we've explored today? Until next time, remember, history is not just a collection of dates and facts. It is a mirror that reflects both our capacity for evil and our potential for redemption. Look into it honestly, uncomfortably if necessary, and learn what it has to teach. This has been the Untold Hour. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and never stop questioning what lies hidden in the shadows of our shared past.